under the soft hum of Christmas carols and the distant clinking of cutlery. Emily stood frozen on the porch of her childhood home in Lake Tahoe. The snow around her was pristine, untouched, a stark contrast to the storm that brewed inside the house. Through the frosted window, she could see her mother pacing with a wine glass clenched too tightly. Her father's jaw locked as he muttered criticisms that cut sharper than any blade. Her brother sat in the corner, arms folded, casting shadows with his silence. To the world, they were a family. To Emily, they were a battlefield. It wasn't the yelling that got to her. It was the years of subtle wounds, the backhanded compliments, the manipulated guilt, the relentless, suffocating pressure to perform, to please, to never disappoint. It was the way love was always conditional, the way silence screamed louder than any argument. And yet, here she was, back again. Every year she told herself this time would be different, that maybe they'd changed, that maybe she had, but each visit was like stepping into a slow-motion avalanche, beautiful on the surface, fatal underneath. This time, though, something inside her had shifted, and that shift had started with a question, a terrifying, liberating question. What if I stopped pretending this was love? The thought stunned her like a slap across the face. What if the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally were the very ones destroying your spirit? What if your greatest act of self-love was walking away from the ones who shared your blood? Emily wasn't looking for revenge. She wasn't angry, not in the way they thought. What she felt was deeper, quieter, the kind of sadness that comes from years of trying to explain your pain to people who only respond with reasons why you shouldn't feel it. She turned away from the window, stepped back into the icy air, and let her breath fog in front of her. For the first time, she didn't feel like the problem. For the first time, she could feel her soul reaching toward something solid, something ancient, a wisdom that whispered, "You are not what they say you are. You are not your family's chaos." That night, alone in the guest room, surrounded by childhood relics, Emily pulled out her journal. The pages had become her sanctuary. She scribbled every insult, every moment of hurt, every time she swallowed a scream. And then, she paused. She wrote something different, something powerful. I do not need their approval to be free. I do not need their permission to choose peace. It was her first act of Stoicism, not a philosophy she had studied, but one she was beginning to live. She didn't yet know the name Marcus Aurelius, but she had instinctively arrived at the heart of his wisdom, that peace comes not from fixing others, but from mastering yourself. And with that, Emily made a quiet vow. I will not let their fire consume me. I will become the fire that forges me. If you've ever stood where Emily stood, wondering if you're the only one who feels like a stranger in your own family, this story is for you. If you've ever questioned whether you're broken, or if the system around you is, stay with me. Her journey is only beginning, and where it leads might just change the way you see your own. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more powerful journeys inspired by Stoic wisdom, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps these stories coming in. It helps more people find the courage to reclaim their peace. Let's spark a conversation. When Emily chose to journal instead of engaging in family drama, what was she doing? A. Avoiding reality and running away from problems. B. Practicing emotional clarity and reclaiming her power. Comment below with your answer. A or B? Let's see how many of us are ready to step into our own strength. The morning after the stormy emotional, not whether Emily slipped out of the house before anyone else had stirred. The air was sharp, her breath visible in the crisp Tahoe morning. Snow blanketed everything in white silence, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe again. There was no plan, no destination, just her boots crunching against fresh powder, and her heart slowly thawing from the chill of unresolved words and heavy family silences. The forest nearby called to her not with noise, but with stillness. A stillness that she'd been craving for years without knowing it, as she wandered beneath tall evergreens. The chaos of the night before replayed in her mind, not like a movie, but like fragments of glass, sharp and disjointed. Her mother's sighs of disappointment, her father's jabs disguised as jokes, her brother's eyes, vacant, detached, and her frozen, again, unable to speak the truth that trembled on the tip of her tongue. Emily paused mid-step. That's what she'd never done before. Pause. She had always reacted, internalized, tried to fix, tried to smile through clenched teeth and cracked dignity. But now, out here in the sacred quiet, she understood what the Stoics meant by the power of the pause. The pause wasn't weakness. It wasn't passivity. It was mastery. Seneca had written, "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity, for he is not permitted to prove himself." Emily had faced adversity, but this time, she wasn't going to meet it with confrontation or retreat. She would meet it with clarity. She found a fallen tree and sat, letting the cold seep into her legs as if to ground her in her body. She looked at her hands, open and trembling slightly, and for the first time whispered, "I am not broken. I'm waking up." Back in Austin, she had developed small rituals without realizing their power, rituals that had, over time, become her silent acts of resistance. The way she brewed her tea each morning, steeping intention with every leaf, the careful pruning of her bonsai tree, shaping something slow and alive. The candles she lit every night, not for light, but for remembrance that she mattered. These rituals weren't random. They were her way of pausing, of remembering who she was before her family told her who she should be. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a pinna cone. It was nothing, and it was everything. She placed it beside her on the log, and let it represent her choice to be grounded, not reactive, to be present, not controlled, as she sat in the hush of the woods. She thought about how many times she had let herself be dragged into drama because silence felt like surrender. But now she saw that the most powerful stance isn't to yell louder, to not need to yell at all. It's to know deeply that your peace is your own, and it doesn't require anyone's permission. Returning to the house would mean stepping back into the fire, but now she wasn't flammable. She was forged. She walked slowly back through the trees, each step a prayer. She wasn't expecting her family to be different, but she expected herself to be anchored, and that expectation changed everything. Later, as she brewed tea alone in the kitchen, she didn't flinch when her mother sighed loudly, clearly hoping to spark something. She didn't tense when her brother made another sarcastic comment. She just kept pouring, steady and calm, not detached, but deliberate. That was her new kind of power. Quiet, but undeniable. Stoic, but deeply alive. And in that moment, she knew something that would carry her for years. Practicing the pause isn't about silence. It's about sovereignty. It's the sacred act of choosing yourself in the middle of noise, of finding stillness not because the world is quiet, but because you've become unshakable in the center of it. Emily was no longer the emotional sponge. She was the calm within the storm, the pause that turned the tide. Emily sat alone at Gate 12 of the Lake Tahoe International Airport, a paper cup of coffee cooling between her palms. Around her, travelers moved in waves, families wrangling luggage, couples whispering plans for the new year. But inside Emily, everything was still, not calm still, like a lake after a storm, where the water hadn't quite settled. The past few days had left invisible bruises. There were no explosive confrontations, no door-slamming arguments, just a heavy, exhausting weight of emotional labor. Every look, every sigh, every passive-aggressive comment had added a layer to the load she now realized she'd been carrying for years. For most of her life, Emily had played the peacekeeper, the fixer, the translator of dysfunction. She had learned early how to read a room, how to predict moods, how to stay small so others wouldn't feel threatened. Her emotional reflexes were sharp, but they came at a cost. Her own peace, her own clarity now, boarding pass tucked in her jacket. She stared at the terminal wall and asked herself a question she'd never dared to before. What am I carrying that no longer belongs to me? She reached into her bag and pulled out her journal, the same one that had caught her tears and thoughts like a net since this trip began. And in a quiet act of defiance, she started a new page titled, What I Choose to Carry. At the top of the list, self-respect, stillness, the right to change. Below that, she began the inventory of what she would not carry anymore. Guilt that isn't mine, shame for being different, the belief that I must earn love. It was a reckoning. Stoic wisdom speaks of learning to distinguish between what serves us and what enslaves us. Emily had never seen her emotional world that way. She thought letting go of pain meant letting go of love, that forgiving meant forgetting, that setting boundaries meant betraying those who raised her. But now, clarity pierced through. Letting go was not rejection, it was release. It was saying, I love you, but I will no longer burn just to keep you warm. As her flight was called overhead, Emily didn't feel triumphant. She felt tender, tired, but also, for the first time in years, she felt honest with herself. On the plane, she stared out at the clouds and let the truth sink in. She couldn't change her family. She couldn't rewrite her childhood, but she could reclaim her narrative. She could choose what came next. And that choice began with emotional minimalism. Not emotional detachment, not numbing or shutting down, but emotional simplicity, a clearing out, a cleaning up. That it was like this. When her mother made a passive dig, she didn't need to internalize it, analyze it, reshape herself around it. She could acknowledge it without adopting it. Just like watching a leaf fall, observed, but not owned. When her father dismissed her career again with a shrug and a smirk, she didn't have to defend herself. Her worth didn't hinge on his understanding. She could hold her success quietly, like a flame cupped in her hands. Emotional minimalism didn't mean less feeling. It meant more room to feel what was real, what was hers. It meant turning down the noise of obligation and tuning into the frequency of her own inner truth. Back in Austin, the city lights greeted her like an old friend. When she stepped into her apartment, it smelled of lavender and cedar, calm and clean. She poured a glass of water, sat on her couch, and opened her journal once more. This time, she didn't need to write pages, just a few lines. I don't need their approval. I don't need to carry what wounds me. I don't need to prove I'm enough. I already am. She closed the journal and exhaled. This was the work, the sacred quiet work of coming home to yourself, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small decisions. To let go, to not grip what cuts you, to choose the lightest load, the clearest path, and with every step forward, she was learning. Peace isn't something you find, it's something you protect, something you prune, something you choose, again and again. 2 months after returning to Austin, Emily stood once again in front of her childhood home, a gift in her hand and a slow, steady breath in her chest. Her father was turning 70, and the whole family had gathered to celebrate. But this time, Emily wasn't walking into the house as a daughter eager to please. She was arriving as someone who had rebuilt herself from the inside out. In the weeks since her last visit, Emily had done something she once thought impossible. She had stopped trying to be understood. Instead, she focused on building what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a fortified place within. Untouched by others' opinions, guarded not with hostility, but with clarity. This wasn't emotional armor. It wasn't a wall. It was the result of hard, honest work, of drawing boundaries not as punishments, but as expressions of self-respect. Inside the house, the familiar dynamics stirred, like dust in a long-forgotten attic. Her mother moved quickly, controlling every detail of the gathering. Her brother hovered near the door, half present, his sarcasm ready like a blade. Yet Emily remained rooted. She had learned how to prepare not for war, but for peace. The night before, she had sat in her apartment, lit a candle, and written out 3 simple phrases. These were her boundary scripts, words she could return to when the moment called for grace but not surrender. I hear what you're saying, but I choose differently. That's not something I'm willing to discuss right now. Let's change the subject. These were not lines of defense. They were lines of definition. During dinner, as the room filled with chatter and clinking glasses, the moment came inevitable and sharp. So, her mother said, pouring more wine than necessary, "Are you ever going to get a real job? Or are you still playing photographer in Austin?" Emily didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't leave the table. She simply set down her fork, looked directly at her mother, and replied, "I love what I do, and I'm proud of the life I've built. No edge, no bitterness, just truth." And that truth was her shelter. Her father chuckled under his breath, as if to dismiss her confidence. Her brother raised an eyebrow, but the energy shifted. Emily had disrupted the cycle not by fighting, but by standing still in her own center. Later, that night, while everyone gathered around old photo albums and cake, Emily stepped away into the den. She didn't need to escape. She just needed a moment to breathe. And in that quiet, she smiled not because things were perfect, but because she no longer needed them to be. Building boundaries hadn't made her colder. It had made her clearer. Back in Austin, she had created what she called her sacred space, a small corner of her apartment filled with things that reminded her who she was. A chair she loved, soft music, a shelf of books that spoke truth when no one else would. It wasn't just a physical space, it was a reminder, a reflection of her inner citadel. She returned to that space after the party, tired but whole. She lit her candle, not as a ritual of escape, but as a ceremony of return to herself, to the version of Emily that no longer negotiated her worth. She remembered something Epictetus had said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." That night, she finally understood what it meant. Freedom wasn't about running away from family or pretending the past hadn't hurt. It was about remaining soft and strong in the same breath, about knowing your lines and loving people, even when you stop letting them cross them. Emily hadn't shut anyone out. She had simply stopped shrinking to fit inside their expectations. And in doing so, she discovered a deeper truth. Real boundaries don't disconnect us. They reveal who we can truly connect with in the art of the inner citadel. She had found her voice, quiet but unmoved, loving but no longer compliant, bound, not bitter. And for the first time in her life, she belonged not to a role, not to a family mold, but to herself. Emily stood at her kitchen counter in Austin, arranging plates of food for her monthly circle dinner. The space buzzed with warm conversation, soft laughter, and the kind of ease that came when people showed up, not out of obligation, but out of mutual care. Around her, friends from all corners of life had gathered: artists, nurses, writers, neighbors. None of them were related by blood, but all of them felt like home. In her family's world, love had always felt conditional, tangled in expectations and old wounds. But here, in this apartment filled with soft light and mismatched chairs, Emily had begun to understand that family could mean something else entirely. The shift hadn't come easily. After her father's birthday gathering in Lake Tahoe, something inside Emily had settled. She didn't feel the urge to convince anyone of her worth anymore. She didn't feel obligated to keep returning to places that didn't nurture her, but walking away, even mentally, from the idea of family she'd clung to her whole life had left a deep ache. It felt like mourning something invisible, a closeness that never was. The fantasy of one day being truly seen by those who raised her. That grief caught her by surprise. She had spent years trying to prove her loyalty, believing that if she just said the right thing, did the right thing, they'd finally meet her with the softness she so desperately craved. But one night, sitting alone with her journal, she had written a truth that cut through every illusion. Maybe they'll never be who I hoped, and maybe that's okay. The words were heavy, but in accepting them, she found space for something lighter, something real. In the weeks that followed, she stopped chasing closure. She stopped trying to rewrite people's stories. Instead, she turned toward the people who met her where she was, her friend Ava, who always noticed when Emily went quiet and asked the gentle questions no one else dared to. Her neighbor Jonah, who left fresh herbs on her doorstep with no note, just kindness. Her mentor Clarissa, who saw her art not as a hobby, but as a language worth speaking. They weren't family in the traditional sense, but they became sacred. At her circled dinners, everyone brought a dish, but more importantly, they brought their presence. Sometimes, they shared stories. Other nights, they sat in easy silence, letting the room itself be a container for whatever needed to be held. There was no performance, no silent scorecard of who called who last. Just a sense of belonging that asked nothing but authenticity. Emily realized this wasn't accidental, it was chosen, and that was the difference. Stoic thought doesn't dwell in fantasy. It meets reality with eyes wide open. And in that spirit, Emily had begun to redefine what family meant to her, not as a static list of names on a holiday card, but as a living circle of people who nurtured her becoming. Self-compassion had been the bridge. It was self-compassion that allowed her to grieve without shame, that let her see her past without erasing its pain, but also without letting that pain dictate her future. It was the quiet voice that reminded her, you're allowed to want more. You're allowed to leave the table where love is conditional. In the mirror of chosen bonds, Emily saw a reflection she could trust. These weren't relationships built on history, they were built on presence, on shared values, on mutual respect. And slowly, she began to understand. Sometimes, the most radical act of healing is choosing who gets to be in your life. That understanding freed her from the guilt that had once chained her. She no longer needed to justify her boundaries or soften her truth to be palatable. She could love from a distance. She could let go without bitterness. She could belong without betraying herself. As the evening wound down and friends drifted out into the Austin night, Emily stayed behind, clearing dishes with a quiet heart. She looked around at the candlelit space and whispered, almost to herself, this is what family can be. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and it was enough. 1 year later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Emily sat on her apartment balcony in Austin, her journal resting on her lap. The early sunlight cast golden lines across the pages, and the city murmured gently below. She sipped her coffee slowly, no longer in a rush to start or finish anything. There was a calmness in her body now, one that had taken time, courage, and no small amount of pain to cultivate. She looked down at the open journal, a simple sentence, written in bold, deliberate strokes. They are who they are. I am who I choose to be. This line wasn't a mantra of defiance. It was an acknowledgement of peace. She no longer needed her family to change in order to find her own center. That realization had come slowly, like dawn, through countless small moments of reflection and restraint. She had stopped demanding that others be the source of her healing and had started becoming the architect of her own peace. Stoicism, which once felt like a distant philosophy, had woven itself into her daily rhythm, not in grand declarations or flawless composure, but in quiet choices. To not respond to a triggering text immediately, to let silence be an answer, to say no without guilt, to let love exist without needing it to be perfect. Emily now saw Stoicism not as a rejection of emotion, but as an invitation to clarity. It taught her that feelings weren't enemies, they were messengers, and she learned to listen without becoming enslaved by them. She had begun to practice amor fati, not just enduring what happened, but embracing it, loving her fate, including the parts that once felt unbearable. She didn't romanticize her family, nor did she villainize them. She simply saw them clearly, as flawed people carrying their own pain, shaped by forces she would never fully understand. She could have empathy without enabling. She could love without sacrificing herself. And most importantly, she could keep her door open without leaving herself unguarded. Her creativity had also become a form of emotional alchemy. Photography had turned into more than a profession, it became a practice of presence. Each frame she captured was an act of honoring stillness, of choosing what to focus on in a world full of noise. She started telling stories, through images, stories of quiet strength, unseen beauty, resilience. Stories like hers. Once, she believed healing meant closure. Now she understood healing meant spaciousness. It meant creating enough internal room to hold contradiction, love and disappointment, closeness and distance, truth and grace. Every day, she returned to her personal Stoic toolkit. When old triggers appeared, she paused. When boundaries were tested, she stayed firm without venom. When loneliness crept in, she reminded herself that solitude could also be sacred. Some nights, she still felt the ache of a family that never really knew her, of birthdays and holidays that felt like performances. But she no longer turned that ache inward. She didn't make it mean she was broken. She simply let it exist then let it pass. There was strength in that quiet, everyday strength. The kind that doesn't get applause but builds a life. Before closing her journal, Emily wrote a final line beneath her earlier thought. Peace is not the absence of chaos. It is the decision to not let chaos govern me. She looked out across the city, the skyline glowing with morning light, and smiled. The path ahead wouldn't be perfect. There would be stumbles, tests, moments of forgetting. But the foundation was there, strong, steady, hers. She didn't need her family to approve of her choices. She didn't need everyone to understand. All she needed was to keep choosing what she had already begun to build, a life of intention, emotional clarity, and unapologetic self-respect. And in that choice, made over and over again, she was finally fully free. Emily's story is not about escape. It's not about revenge or cutting ties to make a statement. Her journey is about reclaiming power, about finally learning to live from the inside out, not from guilt, fear, or inherited dysfunction, but from intention, clarity, and peace. It's about what happens when a person stops waiting for others to change and starts building the life they were always meant to live. When we first met Emily, she was walking back into a house that had never quite felt like home. She carried silent wounds and unspoken hopes. She was exhausted from trying to fix what didn't want to be fixed and to earn what should have been given freely: love, respect, safety. The fire in her family wasn't just external, it burned within her too, fueled by a lifetime of suppressing herself in order to maintain peace that never lasted. But then came the shift, not sudden, not cinematic, but real. She began choosing to pause, to listen, to question what she had always accepted. In the stillness of the forest, the pages of her journal, and the quiet rituals of her daily life, she found something she had never been given growing up: emotional safety. And she gave it to herself. She started filtering her emotions the way a Stoic filters external events, not to eliminate feeling, but to clarify what mattered. She practiced emotional minimalism, shedding the weight of expectations, old narratives, and the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. She learned to stand in the storm without becoming the storm. Her boundaries were no longer acts of defiance, they were declarations of self-worth. But what made Emily's transformation even more powerful was what came after. She didn't isolate herself in self-righteousness or bitterness. She redefined family. She opened her life to people who reflected her values, her softness, her strength. She created space for genuine connection and gave herself permission to grieve what she never had. She didn't run from the past. She stood still long enough to understand it, and then she let it go. And as time passed, she stopped needing resolution. She stopped arguing with what was. She started loving her fate not because it was easy, but because it had shaped her into someone who could finally choose. Choose when to speak, when to stay silent, when to love, when to leave. Her creative expression became an extension of that freedom. Through photography, she found a way to document not just what she saw, but what she felt, moments of stillness, of courage, of unseen resilience. Her art, like her life, became an act of quiet rebellion against chaos. In the end, Emily didn't fix her family. She didn't win them over or prove them wrong. She simply stopped letting them define her. That was the real victory. So what's the lesson here? It's that peace isn't found in other people changing. It's found in your choice to stop giving your power away. You don't need to carry what breaks you. You don't need to stay in conversations that diminish you. You don't need to prove your worth to those who refuse to see it. The Stoic path isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming clear. It's about recognizing that your response is the only true freedom you'll ever have in wielding that freedom with grace. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like Emily, stuck between loyalty and truth, love and survival, know this: you're not alone. And you don't need anyone's permission to heal. You don't need to abandon your family to build peace, but you do need to stop abandoning yourself. You can start small. A journal, a daily pause, a boundary spoken kindly but firmly, a ritual that anchors you. And over time, those small choices build a fortress within you, a citadel, a home. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of Emily's story resonated most with you? Was it the struggle to speak up, the decision to redefine family, or the quiet power of letting go? Share your thoughts in the comments. Just one line, one truth, one feeling. Your words might help someone else find clarity. And if you found this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your support gives us the energy and motivation to keep creating deep, honest, and empowering content like this. Thank you for being here. Keep choosing yourself, keep building your peace, and remember, the life you want doesn't begin when others change, begins when you do.